Hello, ladies and gentlemen, such a pleasure for you to join me. The target audience for this lecture is quite clear. I believe that you should stop and watch because it is recommended for you if you are a conservative, a blue ocean thinker generally, or if you're a sort of a combination of the two above, a conservative socialist, who I think will particularly appreciate this topic. You should go because this is not recommended for you if you are a progressive, mostly because I am not going to be speaking in your language here. This is not going to be compatible with your worldview. If you watch this, you're going to leave with nothing other than frustration and anger. There's absolutely no reason for you to watch this whatsoever, unless you want to get annoyed. And, you know, it's practically everyone else neutral, right? I mean, if you're a socialist or a neoliberal or a libertarian or whatever, if you don't fit into the other two categories, well, you know, you might gain something from this, you might not, but either way, whatever. The Blue Ocean Foundation that will be activated in this lecture will be pragmatism over emotion. And, you know, it's interesting. People tend not to mind faithfulness, especially people who were born in the 90s like myself, or even after. Tends to be quite popular. Collectivism tends to be quite popular as well, except with Americans who think that collectivism is just another word for communism, which is shockingly common. But apart from that, it tends to be quite popular as well. But the pragmatic ones, the ones that promote pragmatism, are always the most controversial, always the most heated. Whether it's the small farm psyop, you know, back in the day, many years ago, some of you might remember, or whether it's caveman conservatives, the pragmatic ones are always the ones that make people seethe the most. But they're also the ones that tend to age the best as well. And I actually think that they're also the ones that are the most necessary, right? Because they're the ones that challenge people's preconceived notions and get them to think outside of their box, which is a very uncomfortable thing to do. But what am I talking about here? Well, as you can probably tell from the retina-burning rainbow background, at the time of recording, the month of June has just passed in the Western world, and June is, of course, the so-called Pride Month for homosexuals. And every June, as strange as this sounds, I can't help but have some sort of new sociological reflection on homosexuals and homosexuality in general, simply because you can't really escape from the topic, right? I mean, if you live in a Western country, there's rainbow flags everywhere. It's, you know, people complain about it, people praise it. It's a cultural battle every year for a month, and it's hard to escape from. And so you can't help but think about it, simply because it's there and it's all around you. And last year, I made a lecture about why I thought progressive events like Pride Month wouldn't last. And I gave my reasons for that. You know, I sort of predicted that, contrary to what a lot of progressives believe, with every year that goes by, should Pride Month continue, the general attitudes towards homosexuals will actually become more hostile, not less. Right, which is what many progressives believe, right? They believe in this linear line of so-called progress, when actually, in reality, human beings are not, you know, we don't operate in that way. And that proved to be remarkably popular, shockingly so. It was seen by hundreds of thousands of people, and I suppose, you know, I didn't even think it was that interesting of a topic, and I still don't, to be truth be told. But I guess it's because it's a cultural hot topic issue, right? And so it drives more attention. But I generally think that this is quite a boring topic, to be totally honest with you. I think there's much more interesting things to talk about. But, you know, apparently not. But this year, keeping up with my recent trend of trying to challenge my more conservative audience into more blue ocean thinking. I'm flipping the script. Last year, I lectured progressives. This year, I want to lecture conservatives. I consider myself a social conservative, very, very strongly so. Phonetically so, perhaps. And there's a lot of things that I believe my fellow social conservatives do well in the 21st century, in the last few years. Bringing attention, for example, to the horrors of the adult material industry, for example. Mass migration, and how it can destroy societies and make them poorer and more divided. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Abortion, you know, whatever. You know, there's so many topics to discuss. But there's one topic that I think social conservatives while I actually agree with a lot of the politics behind it, I think the modus operandi, as in the way that this is spoken about and the way that people go about this topic, is so unbelievably unhelpful, shall we say, that it deserves some reflection. And that is essentially what I'm talking about today. These are harsh truths for conservatives on homosexuality. And you'll note that they're called harsh truths, right? These aren't called my opinions for conservatives on homosexuality, right? Things that may be correct. Perhaps. Up to you, mate. No, these are harsh truths. Truths, as in, they're true, they're facts. These aren't things that are up for debate, but they're harsh. And why are they harsh? Because some things that are true are hard to absorb if you have a certain worldview, or if it's inconvenient for your worldview that these things are true. So these are, what I'm going to talk about here, and there's 5 harsh truths, are things that are absolutely 100% true and they're not debatable whatsoever, which may seem arrogant to say, but I genuinely believe that to be the case. But it's not going to be easy to accept. It's not going to be easy to accept these things. But I want to make it clear, this is not a defense of homosexuality. This is designed for a conservative audience, a social conservative audience, and I will be speaking as such, as a fellow social conservative, not some sort of secret progressive agent provocateur who is trying to steer you into progressivism as it might seem. No, but perhaps you'll see what I mean as we go along. So let's start off with number 1, moral proportionality, and this is arguably the most bombastic of them all. So let's say that you had 2 sons. Okay, so you're a 40, 50, 60-year-old man or woman, whatever. You've got 2 sons, they're both 20, 25, whatever, like young adults, right? 2 of them. Now, your first son is a gay son, right? Could you tell? What gave it away? But he's a gay man, right? And he's unashamed of his sexuality. He's open about it. He's not closeted, right? But he's also respectfully reserved about the specifics of his private life. He doesn't talk about his sexuality to you. He knows you're a conservative person, right? He doesn't, when you see him, he doesn't go, hey, you'll never guess what I did last night. Yeah, I did this. No, he doesn't talk about it. He views sexuality actually in a very conservative way as a private matter, something to, you don't talk about what you get up to in the bedroom to other people, certainly not to your parents, right? So he's gay, he's open about it, but he's reserved. He doesn't make being gay his entire personality, he's hush about what he gets up to. Okay, that's one of your sons. Your other son's straight, okay? However, he's also an unapologetic, reckless deadbeat who created 3 single mothers. Okay, so he's straight, but he goes around having intercourse with women, left, right, and centre. Charming them, gets them pregnant, abandons them, moves on to the next woman. Essentially, your grandchildren are all being raised by single mothers, and you're sort of having to take the role as the grandparents, as the father figure, because he's not bothered. He's just going around, jumping into bed with another woman. As soon as he makes one, he's making another one. Now, I want you to take your 2 sons here, right? None of which you might be completely happy with for different reasons, but I want to ask you a very serious question. Which one of your sons is the better man? And when I say better man, I mean the morally better man. As in, which one of your sons is the most likely to go to heaven, if we want to put it in a religious way? Now, keep in mind, the description of these sons only relates to their sexuality, right? I've not told you anything else about them. I've not told you about, I don't know, where they work or what they get up to. No, all you know about them in this example is their sexuality. So judging them purely based on their sexual activities, which one of your sons is the morally better man, would you say? And I'm genuinely asking you, what would you say? What's your opinion between these 2? Well, I'll give my opinion, right? I would rather have a gay son than a deadbeat son. Period. Like 100%. It's not even a question to me. And I feel like that would be quite an unpopular opinion. within a lot of socially conservative circles to say something like that. Because when people hear the term gay or homosexual, they automatically have this sort of disgust or revulsion, sort of in the negative. But if you zoom out and see the bigger picture here, morally speaking, this position is completely logical. Because let's compare the consequences of both of your two sons' sexual behaviours. All right, so the gay son, for example, what are the consequences of his sexual behaviour? Well, statistically, more likely to result in higher rates of sexually transmitted infections and diseases, right? Now, that is not a homophobic comment, that's a fact. That's a medical fact, that's a biological fact. Why? Well, look, this shouldn't need an explanation, but we're all adults here, let's not be squeamish, let's be mature. You know, heterosexual intercourse, you have the male with the penis and the female, the woman with a vagina. These two sexual organs are, of course, made for one another and are obviously compatible with one another. It's how life is made, right? But homosexual intercourse between men is a simulation of heterosexual intercourse. And so obviously, one of the men has a penis. Well, that's a given. But obviously, there's no vaginas involved in this equation because it's two men. And so there has to be a substitute for the vagina. What is the substitute that's used? The anus. But unlike the vagina, the anus is, of course, not designed to be an input, shall we say. You know, it's designed to be an output. Not only is it an output, it's an output of waste. So it's arguably one of the worst places that you could put your crown jewels into, shall we say. Again, I understand this is quite an uncomfortable topic to talk about, but we're all adults here, you know, right? And so naturally, because of this, homosexual men who engage in intercourse with men tend to have much higher rates of sexually transmitted infections and diseases. That's just a fact. It's not a homophobic comment. It's a factual observation. It would be very surprising if there was a gay man who wasn't aware of this, which is why a lot of precautions are taken, or at least should be taken, when getting involved in such activities. But that is a downside. That is a consequence. It is factually true. You are more likely to get such by engaging in such intercourse. And I suppose you could say that adds an unnecessary small additional strain to healthcare services due to treatments from such. I mean, if you have a socialist healthcare system like the NHS, for example, it might be a little bit more clogged up, or even in a private system, it's still going to be a little bit more clogged up. Granted, I say small because I don't think there's ever in human history been a case of a healthcare system collapsing because there's been so many gay men going in, using it to try and get treatment for STIs and STDs. No, it's it's not that big of a deal. It's going to be minuscule of a problem in terms of population, but it is still, you could say, a downside. And I suppose an obvious one, it makes many from the heterosexual majority feel disgusting and uncomfortable, right? I mean, look, most people are heterosexual. When they think of homosexual intercourse, it's going to disgust them. You know, they have this revulsion to it. You can't exactly... heterosexuals cannot be blamed for such a revulsion. Again, I've mentioned in the past about the psychological studies that have been done on conservatives where it's been hooked up, machines have been hooked up to scan their brainwaves, and a picture of two men kissing had the same reaction as maggots on rotting flesh. It might be an uncomfortable or a bit of a sad fact, especially for many homosexuals, but it is true. A lot of the revulsion it's not necessarily environmentally ingrained, more so as it is naturally ingrained. So, that's one. I suppose that's one downside. And another downside, of course, it won't produce any offspring, right? I mean, if you have a son, and your son's gay, he's not gonna pass on his genes more likely than not. I mean, it's possible technically. There's nothing particularly stopping him, but he's probably not going to. And so, if that's your only son or your only offspring, well, that's the end of the bloodline, right? Which is quite unfortunate considering you've spent, 2 decades raising him, and that's it. That's just the end of the line. Which is why you should have multiple offspring, I suppose. But that is a downside. Let's not pretend as if that's if individualists would say that's not a downside at all, but it is a downside, really. I think that is a disappointment to a lot of people, a lot of parents, that they wouldn't have any grandchildren, right? Okay, so that's the downsides of the gay son's sexual behaviour. But what about the deadbeat son, the straight deadbeat son? Well, Downsides for his would be resulted in the creation of numerous offspring who are statistically more likely to live much worse lives via his absence. That downside alone, dare I say, is worse than all the others on the gay son's side combined. I mean, the consequences of this, summarised in that tiny little paragraph, are almost hard to comprehend. I mean, just think, this guy had intercourse with a woman for what, a few minutes? Okay, and the result of that few minutes has been 18 years, and it's more than that really, because let's not pretend as if when people turn 18 it's like, right, that's it, they've got their lives together, especially if they grew up with an absent father. It's usually even longer than that they're very messed up. Multiple decades worth of suffering for a few minutes of pleasure. I mean, thinking about it mathematically speaking, it's actually quite mind-blowing really, how selfish and unbelievably evil in many ways that is. You know, like, to create someone, bring them into the world, have an obligation to teach them about life, and bring them into adulthood, and you choose not to. I mean, that is unbelievably more catastrophic for society than, oh, I don't know, the healthcare system might be a bit more clogged up, or some people feel disgusted, you know, or some families won't carry on because they didn't produce more offspring themselves. I mean, it's not even comparable. But we're not done yet. That's just one. Another one directly steamrolled the lives of the now single mothers. I mean, if you're a woman, you get pregnant, and the man makes it very clear to you that he wants nothing to do with you or your offspring, your life is steamrolled. You're in a very difficult position because you either have an abortion, in which case, which you might not want to do because, factually speaking, you're killing your kid, right? Especially if you're a religious person, you're not going to want to do that. But even if you're not going to want to do that. Or you raise your son or daughter for decades on your own, or with very little assistance, in which case you're going to have the stereotype of being a single mother above your head, which is viewed as universally a net negative. Even in a highly progressive society, being a single mother is not a good thing, because it isn't, obviously. So everyone's going to judge you for that. Statistically, your son and daughter is going to be stunted growing up because they had no father. I mean, your life has been steamrolled. It's like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. You either become a killer, or you have a very miserable life for decades. You know, I mean, this is a terrible situation here, which is one of the things that annoys me. It annoys me. I don't want to sound like a feminist, I really don't here, because I despise feminism with every fibre of my being, but it really does annoy me. Like, one of the grand cosmic injustices of the world is that when it comes to recreational intercourse, it's the women who suffer way more than the men. The men can just run away and just have bye-bye, move on to someone else, and the women are stuck there with this burden and have to make these very difficult decisions. There's something so cosmically, that's such a cosmic injustice, really. Which is why I say that such men should be castrated, but that's a story for another time. Makes life harder for other men by contributing significantly to negative stereotypes about men, right? I mean, look, you know, when women complain about men, what is it that they always say in such a cliche and immature fashion? There's no good men. Where are all the good men in the world? They're all the same. You know, it's like, of course there are good men in the world. It just so happens that your taste in men is absolutely atrocious. But these men, because of these dark tetrad men, if you would, because of what they do, they promote this negative stereotype about men, that men only care about sex and don't care about family and are useless and deadbeats and blah, blah, blah. And because there's a lot of these men, women can point at these men and go, yeah, man, men are awful, aren't they? God, they're so terrible. You know what? I'm not gonna be a mother. I'm not having this risk, right? Basically, these men and the consequences of what they do make the lives of every other man on earth worse, which contributes to the endless gender wars and makes everything worse in society. It's horrendous. And of course, let's not forget, it's created a gargantuan cultural and economic burden for wider society for generations. I mean, God, welfare payments. Who's going to pay for the offspring? He's not, so who is? Even if the mother works, who's going to look after the offspring when she's working? Will it be their parents? What if they're working? Or what if they're dead? So who's going to pay for the childcare? There's always an economic burden because of men like this. But it's not just an economic burden, it's a cultural burden. More likely to join gangs, more likely to do drugs. I've listed all these statistics before. We know in every country where there's a fatherless crisis, we know about these consequences. Society is the one that picks up the bill. You pick up the bill. Even if you have nothing to do with this man or this woman or their offspring, you pay the consequences for this behaviour. And again, I just want to point out all of these consequences for a few minutes of sexual pleasure. All of these decade-long consequences that all of us have to deal with because some guy wanted to get laid, right? I mean, if you put these side by side, the gay son and whatever he gets up to in his private life has almost nothing. It's almost nothing in comparison to what the deadbeat straight son is doing, right? And you could reverse the genders on this, and in fact, I actually think it becomes more clear when you use two daughters as an example. Again, let's say that you had a lesbian daughter. Same thing as the gay son. She's unashamed, right? So she's out the closet, but she's respectfully reserved about the specifics of her private life. She doesn't talk about it like, oh yeah, I did this last night. No, she's reserved, right? But then you have a straight daughter, and kind of like the gay son, however, she is a strumpet who has had so many abortions, she is nicknamed the Aztec Temple. Right? I mean, again, if you take these two daughters of yours, and I ask the question, which one of your daughters is the better woman, the morally better woman, the woman who is more likely to go to heaven, let's say if you wanted to use religious language, who has done less damage to society, it's not even a question. This one's even more obvious. I would rather have a lesbian daughter than an abortionist daughter. 100%, it's not even a question in my mind. And why? Again, well, let's compare the consequences of their sexual behaviour again. And again, this is actually more blatant. What is the consequences of the lesbian daughter? Well, she makes many heterosexual men feel envious and uncomfortable, right? I mean, we all know this, right? I mean, especially if a woman's very attractive, and she says she's a lesbian, men go, really? Are you sure you're really a lesbian? Oh, come on, you can't be a lesbian. It makes them feel uncomfortable. It's like, no, you'll never have them. And it's like, well, that's really annoying. I'm quite envious of in this situation. That's quite common. By the way, I suppose you could say many straight women are also envious of that a man is gay. Right? George Michael comes to mind, right? Like many women found George Michael to be very attractive, but he's gay, so he's not interested. You could use this on the other example as well, I suppose. Very minuscule a consequence, but it's a consequence. And of course won't produce any offspring, right? Again, it's not that they can't, it's that they won't, because they're only interested in women. There's no, sperm involved in this equation, right? So that's sad for the parents, that you're not going to get any grandchildren from her, I suppose. But again, what about the straight abortionist daughter? Well, good Lord. Let's start off with the obvious one. Has successfully requested, via the use of a third-party hitman, the murder of the offspring that she chose to make before they were even fully developed. I mean, this woman has made someone to die and has signed on the dotted line to do it multiple times. I mean, it's one thing to do it once. To do it multiple times, I mean, good Lord, man. I mean, there's not much of an excuse for that, is there, really? And of course, scarred the self, both physically and mentally, often having lifelong negative consequences as a result. I mean, look, it's a well-known fact that if a woman sleeps around or has abortions and whatever, we all know, psychologically speaking, they're much more likely to be mentally ill, have less self-esteem, more likely to self-harm, more likely to have tendencies thinking of ending their lives, right? I mean, these are well-known, it's very well documented that there are mental consequences to this behaviour. This sort of behaviour, a woman engaging in recreational intercourse, often feels good before they do it, and perhaps during they do it, but after they do it, they usually feel terrible. But it creates this strange cycle where that makes them want to do it even more to try and get a high again. So it's very unusual. And of course, again, makes life harder for other women by contributing significantly to negative stereotypes about women. When men complain about women in the modern era, what is it that they say? Hoes, the whores, they all have OnlyFans and all this stuff, right? It's women like this who throw themselves around that make the average woman, who is much more modest and respectable, get treated worse by short-sighted men, shall we say, who refuse to even analyse their character but simply dismiss them outright for being a woman. Essentially, the woman becomes an abstracted enemy to a lot of men, which we see today. And it's because of women like this, partially. Again, the consequences of these two people on society are not even comparable. It's not even a competition. I mean, look at the size of the text, for example. Just that alone. There's this common stereotype of homosexuals being the devil's people, right? You hear this a lot in religious circles, for example. Like, if you're gay, pray the gay away, or that the spirit of Satan is within you. You've got to pray, like, you've been touched by the devil, right? Like, this is a common stereotype throughout history, throughout time, even today, right? But I have to be totally honest with you, and I have never, ever in my life seen anyone make this argument, but I don't see how it possibly couldn't be true. Ironically, homosexuals actually seem more of an angelic people when compared to heterosexuals. I mean, if you really think about it, to be clear, I'm not saying homosexuality is morally good, or it is a good thing, but I'm saying that if you think of the capabilities of sin, if you would, I'm speaking in a religious sense here, or the capabilities of negative societal consequences, to say it in a more secular sense, heterosexuals are limited by the fact that they can't reproduce and therefore essentially have naught to do with offspring, right? Homosexuals don't have abortions, right? Homosexuals don't abandon their offspring. Of course, I know someone will say that there's some niche example that you could give me where that is the case, but typically speaking, it is not possible because a man's in a relationship with a man, a woman's in a relationship with a woman, right? And so, typically speaking, generally speaking, if you don't take into consideration very strange exceptions, there's, the only damage that you could say that homosexuals do because of their sexuality is to themselves, which they're already more than conscious of, surely, right? But heterosexuals can do damage by killing their offspring, by abandoning them, spiraling out of control in society. I mean, I have never heard anyone make the claim before that actually, when you strip away all the other personality elements of a human being and look at them purely based on sexuality, heterosexuals, straight people, have a much higher capability of doing societal damage than homosexuals ever do, right? It's not that I'm saying that homosexuals are angelic. It's that simply because of the nature of the limitations of the consequences of their sexuality, this is the case, as strange as it sounds. Does that make sense? I want to talk a little bit about how and why many conservatives negatively target homosexuals, because I feel like that is what I've just said there about the ridiculousness of the devil's people stereotype relates to, I think that many conservatives use homosexuals as a sort of target dummy, like a training dummy, like target practice, like a sort of scapegoat. Like, if you're a conservative person and you know that you're not a good person, like you might be a cheat, maybe you've cheated on your wife or your husband, you've had an abortion, or you've convinced a woman to have an abortion, or some other terrible thing, right? You can sort of point to a homosexual, a gay person, and go, yeah, I might have cheated on my wife and I might have killed my kid, but hey, at least I'm not gay, right, guys? And other conservatives go, yeah, right, exactly. Homosexuals are used as sort of like a group that conservatives can point at and feel better that they are not them. Like, at least I'm not them. But I've never heard the argument said, well, actually, I think I'd rather you be one of them than what you are. I mean, really, I have much more respect for a gay man or a lesbian woman than I do a man who abandons his offspring or has a woman who's had an abortion. 100%. Why is it that the sexuality is viewed as the be-all end-all, the most important thing, when in reality, surely the consequences on society at large are far more important, practically speaking, than the sexuality? It doesn't make sense. And I think that the conservatives have this sort of tribal out-group bias against homosexuals, where it's like, it's an us against them, right? They're the other and we're the same thing, and so we've got to back each other up. And it results in this very, very meticulous I also want to say, I don't want to say bullying, because that makes it sound infantile and not serious, but sort of automatic default, like, you're evil, you're bad, and I'm a saint and I'm angelic. When in reality, it's like, nope. In many cases, it's actually it could be the other way around. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, it could be. And I do think that conservatives, particularly religious conservatives, should be much more considerate of the fact that is the reason why you focus on homosexuals so much because you're actually trying to recompense your own moral downsides. You're trying to make yourself feel better by putting them down. When in reality, on a subconscious level, perhaps you're aware that some of the things you've done are much worse than some of the things they've done. To be clear, I'm not saying this is necessarily always the case. There are some people who are just, going along with the tribal bubble, but I do think that's a consideration that needs to be taken a lot more seriously. But of course, for many conservatives, hostility to homosexuals originates from their religious beliefs, right? It might not have anything to do with the tribal bubble necessarily, or trying to make themselves feel better, but it's because it goes against their religion. And, in all the free Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, this is undoubtedly true. A lot of people like to beat around the bush when it comes to religious scripture, like, makes them feel shy or sheepish or whatever. Well, I'm not one of these people. Let's see, let's make it very clear what all three of these major religions, the positions are on homosexuality. In Judaism, homosexuality in the Torah, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. All right, well, that's pretty clear. Homosexuality in the Bible for Christianity. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions, though women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men, and received, in their own persons, the due penalty for their error. All right, a bit of a long way to put it, but that's one way to put it. And of course, homosexuality in the Quran for Islam. Do you approach men with passion instead of women? You are a people who are ignorant. All right, so evidently the theology is clear, and any attempt to ignore it would result in a hypocritical pick and mix approach. Right, so there's this sort of, let me put it this way. Does anyone remember back in like the 2000s, and I say the 2000s because I haven't seen this in a cinema in the last few years, but they used to do this. It used to be called pick and mix. I don't know if this was just a British thing. Surely it was in other countries as well. But pick and mix was like, you had these different like boxes, and you were given like a paper bag and like a plastic trowel, and then you went around to all these boxes and you picked the things that you liked and you discarded the things that you didn't like, right? I'm not just making this up, right? Because I haven't seen one of these in years for some reason. They looked like that, right? You had all these different sweets in them. And I remember specifically there used to be one that I used to love, and it was called the Love Hearts. Right, I think they're called Swizzles Love Hearts or something, and they were like these, I don't know, they were like minty things. They weren't really minty, but they were like sweet little, almost looked like tablets almost. And they had these little messages on that you can see. I remember there was one message, it said, I surrender. I don't know why, but I always thought that was so amusing. That was my favourite one, of course it was, obviously. But, there was like this, I used to love these, so I used to pack my bag with tons of Love Hearts. But then there was this other thing, and they were called, oh my God, just looking at them makes me feel sick. They were called, I think they're called flying saucers. British people, you must remember, you must know what I'm talking about here. These things were the worst tasting pieces of garbage you've ever seen. Oh, like artificial colours, they like melt in your mouth. It's like putting cardboard in your mouth. They were horrible, right? But the good thing about pick and mix was you could pick the things that you liked, in my case the Love Hearts, and you never had to pick the garbage that you didn't like, such as the flying saucers, ever again, right? So you only got the things that you liked, right? So you can pick and choose. And the problem is a lot of religions, a lot of religious people, when it comes to the topic of homosexuality in the modern world, many religious people like to pick and mix, right? So they say like, oh, I'm a Christian, for example, but I support the LGBT community, and it's like, well, what are you talking about? As we've just seen in the scripture, that is a hypocritical position to take, right? And there's a lot of movements like this in all of the Abrahamic religions that do this sort of picking and mixing, right? So, for example, within Judaism, Reform Judaism is often criticized as being a hypocritical pick and mix movement, right? Because in Judaism, for those who don't know, rabbis are meant to be men. But at Reform Judaism, you can have a woman be a rabbi, right? Obviously, like, gay marriage is prohibited in Orthodox Judaism, for example, but in Reform, it's like totally fine, right? So it's much more like progressive, modern, right? Reform Judaism tends to be much more popular in places like the United States or the United Kingdom, much less popular in Israel, right? It's sort of seen as like the sort of like black sheep of Judaism. Like if you talk to somebody who's Orthodox and say, "What do you think about Reform?" They'll be like, "No, they're not following the Scripture. Like they're just making up their own rules," right? See what I mean by pick and mix, right? And within Christianity, Anglicans in the Church of England, certain Protestants in America, or Catholics in Germany are often criticised for being pick and mix. Yeah, I mean, if you look at this picture here, it's like I don't know where this is from, but I think it's a perfect summary of like pick and mix Christianity in a way. It's like, yeah, we're Christians, but then you've got like the woman priest, you've got like the pride flag and the racist version of the pride flag as well, not just the normal one, on the church, which is like an imperialist symbol, like a symbol of conquest. And you've got to, you look at this and it's like, what is going on here? Like, are you Christian or are you progressive? What is this weird, what is this pick and mix? Like, you've got the church, you say that you love Jesus, but yet what are you doing here? You're promoting this, like, what's going on, right? This is highly criticized as pick and mix, right? And of course, funnily enough, even within Islam, there is a mostly online progressive Islam movement, which is almost universally regarded as being pick and mix. Now, you'll notice how it's mostly online. That's because it's not just that Islamic countries tend to be much more strict on their scripture. God, that's a tongue twister. But it's also that the Quran itself is very, very blunt and very, very direct. It's much more blunt and direct than the Torah or the Bible, the Old Testament or the New Testament. Like the Quran is like, there's no way that a human being could read the Quran and have any and be able to bend it or have any miscalculations about what it stands for. In fact, it actually points out a lot of hypocrisy. For example, it says, do you believe in some parts of the scripture and reject others? Is there any reward for those who do so among you other than disgrace in this life and being subjected to the harshest punishment on the day of judgment? For Allah is never unaware of what you do, right? I mean, it's kind of hard, unlike in, say, Judaism or in Christianity, where there is, these books do, the scripture does call out hypocrisy, but in Islam it is really like clear as crystal. And it's not just this, there's loads of passages like this where it's like, hey, don't even think about pick and mixing in this religion. Like if you're a Muslim, you follow the Quran to the word, right? So it makes sense that it's mostly online and not in reality. In fact, it might not even be made up by Muslims. Really, it might be made up by progressive agent provocateurs, which I would imagine is very likely. But you get the point, right? Like, it's easy to understand the frustrations many religious people have with the pick and mix approach, right? That but the thing is that I'm not telling religious conservatives to start waving rainbow flags around, approve of homosexuality, or abandon eternal scripture for temporal modernity, which I think a lot of people will think that I'm trying to do. If you belong to one of these religions, for example, and you hear me saying that actually homosexuals seem to be more angelic in behavior than many heterosexuals, you can hear the alarm bells going off, going, hey, what's going on here? What's going on here? This guy's trying to make me turn my back on my religion. But the problem is you can't do that to conservatives, and you can't do that to religious conservatives, because if you really believe in Judaism, in Christianity, and Islam, then you believe in God, and you revolve your entire life around God, around the scripture, around the religion. You live and breathe it every day. Who the hell am I, as a man, a mere mortal, to come to you and say, hey, actually, you're wrong, and you've got to change your mind on this that just doesn't make any sense. If I asked you to do any of these things, which, by the way, none of which I do myself, I would be asking you to take your religion less seriously. In fact, I would be asking you to pick and mix. I'd be asking you to become an atheist, essentially. Become either an atheist outright or a pick and mixer. So it would be an insult to your religion. It would be an insult to your worldview if I asked you to do that. But I'm not asking you to do that. On the contrary, I am telling religious conservatives to take their religion more seriously, not less seriously, not make concessions for the progressive modern world. No, I'm asking you to take your religion more seriously. How so? To become more of a civilizationally minded theologian. Don't just think about religion in terms of the individual, like, oh, that's a gay guy, that's bad. No, think about it in terms of the collective society that you are a part of. Like think about sin, if you would, for the whole, not just the man, not just the men, the women, the individuals, but the collective. But in order to do that, you must discern moral virtues and sins based on such scaling. Right? You have to view, like, in comparison to other people in society, what is this man doing? What is this woman doing? But that requires you, in a way, to attempt to think like God, no matter how impossible. I mean, it's impossible to think like God, because God's God. But you have to try to think like God. I mean, the entire aim of every religious person, whether you're following Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, is to try to get it's almost like Jacob's ladder in a way. You're trying to climb up the ladder and get as close to heaven, as close to God as possible, even though you know it's impossible, even though you know you're not nowhere near as morally, you're a sinner, right? You're not a completely virtuous man or a virtuous woman, but you try. No matter how futile it is, you try, because you know in your heart of hearts that there is a God and you believe in him and you want to get closer to him. You want to make him proud, like a father wants to be proud of his son. That's what you're doing, and that's not futile. But in order to do that, you have to try to think like him in order to get closer to him. If you don't understand him, then how can you possibly be him? How can you, or try to imitate him, right? And that's what I'm asking you to do here. You know, there's this idea of God's divine verdict, right? Like God is always, if you're a religious person, you believe this, like God is always watching you. God is watching over you. He is judging you. When you do a sin, you feel guilty. You can feel his eyes looking down on you. You can feel him breathing down on your neck. You can feel him go, like, I'm disappointed in you, like you should have known better. But when you do something good, you sort of look up to him and go like, are you proud of me? Right? So again, it's like a relationship between a father and a son. If you're a religious person, you know and you believe that God is constantly judging you, and at the end of your life, you'll be given a divine verdict, right? Like, are you worthy of heaven or hell or somewhere in between, right? Like that is what you believe. But I want you to imagine for a moment, and this is obviously a ridiculous hypothetical, but, go along with it. God took a day off, right? God took a day off. He's like, you know what? I'm tired of judging people. I've had enough for a bit. I'm going to Benidorm. You're my, I'm going to trust you. You're going to judge today who goes into heaven and who goes into hell. I'm going to let you decide, right? Even though you're obviously going to do a much worse job because you're inferior to God, right? But he's trusting you. And so you're there, you've got the gates of heaven and you've got the gates of hell, right? And everyone who dies today, you're going to go through their life and go, right, who's going where? However, on this day, there's only 2 spots left, right? Heaven and hell is pretty full. They've not made an extension yet. So there's only 2 spots left. So, you better hope only 4 people die today. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem on your hands. There's going to be a big queue and people aren't going to be happy. Fortunately, four people did die today. 4 people died in a car crash, or unfortunately, I should say. And look who it is, right? What a coincidence. It's the 2 sons and the 2 daughters from earlier, right? Well, that's interesting, because you've been given by God a task. Who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, right? And what I'm saying to you is the answer to this question, the more morally correct answer to this question, to me seems so obvious. The 2 homosexuals are going to heaven and the 2 heterosexuals are going to hell. And the reason for that is because the damage that the homosexuals have done, not because they are homosexual necessarily, the damage that the heterosexuals have done, not because they are heterosexual, but it is much worse than anything that the homosexuals have done, right? Like the guy who abandoned his offspring and the woman that killed her offspring are obviously much more deserving of a place in hell than the man or the woman who like men and women, right? To be clear, again, I'm not saying that homosexuality is good or virtuous or angelic, as we've seen in the scripture that I have laid out so very clearly. In the Abrahamic religions, this is not the case. What I am saying, however, in this specific example, which I admit is a ridiculous example, it's an unrealistic example, because it's not like heaven and hell would be limited. But in this example, where would you put these four people? And if you agree with me that in this example it would actually be the homosexuals who would go to heaven and the heterosexuals who would go to hell, then you understand moral proportionality, right? You understand. You think like a civilizationally minded theologian, right? And you understand that sexuality alone, homosexuality alone, is not this be-all, end-all, catch-all, oh my God, it's like worse than anything, right? You understand that there are worse things, if you would, and that clearly what the two heterosexuals there, the straight son and the straight daughter, have done is infinitely worse than what their brothers and sisters did, right? That's the point that I'm trying to make here, and that is very rare. That is such a rare point of view that I very rarely see anyone else say. And this brings us on to my first harsh truth. And you know it's serious when the background goes red and I start typing in caps. But the first harsh truth is heterosexual dysfunction has spread more evil in society than homosexuality ever has. And I don't understand how anyone could possibly argue against that. Again, I've laid out the scripture. I'm not telling people to change their religions. I'm not saying that homosexuality is angelic or it is a virtue. I'm saying that exactly what I'm saying there. Heterosexual dysfunction, deadbeat fathers, women who have abortions, that is far more evil, if you want to put it that way. That causes much more dysfunction in society than two gay men and two gay women living reserved private lives than it ever would. That's not a woke position. That's not a progressive position. Progressives would be furious at that position, that I'm even contemplating it as a potential negative, that I'm even saying, that I'm even giving social conservatives credit by saying, I can understand that there are some negatives there. But this is a completely reasonable position to hold, that I am baffled that more social conservatives do not have the perception to zoom out and see. But I guess that's why it's a harsh truth. Which brings us on to number 2, opportunity costs. And all these harsh truths, they relate to each other. So let's say that you get up for work, right? And you usually get up at 12. I'm not quite sure what job you do to get up at 12, but whatever. And, well, you go to work at 12, I should say. And you leave at 6, right? So 12 to 6. So you work for 6 hours, right? Great mathematics skills there, Alex. Wonderful work. Okay, but, however, wow, you get a phone call from your boss. And he says, hey, don't come in today. We've decided to renovate the office, so you've got a day off, and we're still going to pay you, so don't worry about it. All right, bye. Right? So, well, what does that mean? Well, it means you have free 6 hours, right? You've got 3 hours at 6 hours for free that you don't know how to spend because you've not made any arrangements because you thought you'd be at work. And so, what are you going to do? Right? You've got to think. And so, well, one thing you might do is maybe you might go bowling, right? You could tell that I've come up with these suggestions. I love bowling. You might go bowling. You might go, why not have a little bit of a bowl? It would be a bit strange if you were bowling on your own. You'd have to find someone else to go with you. But besides the point, you might go for a little bit of a bowl. Or maybe, there's a new Italian restaurant that's opened up. They do pizzas, pasta, spaghetti. I love Italian food. People have been raving about it. It's got 5 stars. Now's your chance to go in there and give it a try. Why not? That's one thing you could do. Another thing is, hey, why not go for a nice walk in the park, a nice jog in the park, actually, get some exercise going, while the park's empty during the work hours. You can enjoy the nature and the nice weather. Hey, wouldn't that be great? Look at how beautiful that park is. Wonderful. Maybe you want to read a book, right? You've been reading, you've got loads of books to read. There's one book that you've been wanting to finish for so long. You've not had the time. Well, now you've got the time, right? Why not spend a while finishing the book that you've been wanting to read? Or, of course, your good friend Alex has just uploaded a new lecture. that you find that you are absolutely 100% interested in because you have fantastic taste, and so of course you've seen that upload and you're thinking, man, I've got to check that out, right? So there you are. So you've got a lot of things that you could do, right? There's a lot of choices that you could do, but there's a problem, right? You only have 6 hours, and each one of these things takes 2 hours to do, right? So what does that mean? Well, you've only got time for free, right? You can't do all 5. You've only got time for free. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, of course, you've got to pick, what do you want to do and what do you not want to do? Well, you can have your opinions about what you would pick and what you wouldn't pick, but out of these, if these were my choices, here's what I would pick. Well, let's start off with the no-brainer, right? Obviously, we're going to watch the latest lecture by that very handsome gentleman there. I mean, what are we, crazy? I mean, we'd have to be out of our minds not to pick that one. No, that's an instant pick there. Another one we might pick, well, you know what? I'm a little bit hungry, right? My stomach's rumbling a bit here. I fancy a pizza, like, why not? I think that'd be pretty good. And as for the third one, well, you know what? Why not go to the park, have a little bit of a jog, right? So the lecture's inside, you go and eat the food, and then you go outside. That's a nice balanced day, I would say. That's pretty good. But unfortunately, however, that means that when it comes to the bowling and the reading, well, we can't do it, right? So we have forgone bowling and reading in order to do the other things. And this is what's called an opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost, which is an economics term, a business term, if you would. It's not just something that I've come up with, obviously, but it is essentially, because of the things that you have done, what are the things that you cannot do because of the things that you've done, right? That's a very convoluted way to put it, but I think you understand. It's the cost, the things that you have lost by doing the things that you have done, right? So our opportunity cost for the lecture, the pizza, and the park is bowling and reading, right? That's our opportunity cost. And opportunity cost also works in politics as well, in a slightly different way. I mean, for example, let's say that in your country, the top concerns of the time would be crime, right? You've had a big crime spree lately, so everyone's talking about crime. People are worried about crime. After that, healthcare, right? Healthcare's pretty bad. You got to fix that. Immigration's out of control. The economy's doing badly, and then after that, people are worried about climate change or whatever, right? So there's a wide range of concerns, but crime is clearly number one. Okay. Let's say that you had 2 politicians, one from the Red Party, one from the Blue Party, right? And in their manifestos and in their speeches, they look at these, all the problems that the nation has, and they go, right, what should we talk about the most, right? And the guy from the Red Party, he talks about crime the most. He's like, we're going to lock these drug dealers up, we're going to put them in behind bars, and the police are going to have way more money and blah blah blah, right? Whereas the guy from the Blue Party, he dedicates a lot of his manifesto and speeches to talking about trees, right? Like, we're going to plant 1 million trees by 2030, and we're going to have clean air, right? Well, the election rolls around, the votes are counted. Unsurprisingly, the Red Party guy won, he got 25 million votes. The Blue Party guy lost, he had 5 million. Why? Well, because the guy in the Red Party, obviously, he spoke about the nation's top concerns. Right? If it was the other way around, then the guy in the Blue Party would have won. Right? But he didn't. Right? So the guy in the Blue Party spoke about the environment, which clearly was a concern because it got 5 million votes. But his opportunity cost for talking about the environment was not talking about crime. And as a result of that miscalculation, clearly, in a democratic system, he lost voters to his rival. Right? So that, you see what I mean? Opportunity cost is an important, extremely important pillar in democratic politics. So you have to talk about the things that people care about the most, because every second that you don't spend talking about those things is a second that your rivals could, or that you could have, right? So you're limiting your appeal. If your priorities are wrong, if your opportunity costs are massive, you're damaging yourself, basically. And progressives often suffer the most for this, I find, right? Like, you'll hear, like, in the UK, for example, you've got a massive housing crisis, right? Like, huge housing crisis. Young people can't afford houses, and then the progressives, like, will go out of their way and be like, hey, do you know sex work is real work? we need to have like protections for prostitutes, and people are just like really, like, you're spending this much of your manifesto and this much of your speeches and social media time talking about this niche issue that 0.1% of people care about. In fact, a lot of people would disagree. But the thing that everyone's talking about, you don't talk about. Progressives do this a lot. The funny thing about progressives is they always get angry when you say that, because they'll say, no, we do talk about housing. But the problem is they talk about it in like paragraph 25, rather than paragraph 1, and paragraph 1 being the only paragraph, right? Like, conservatives tend to be much better at messaging and like drilling down like a small handful of messages that people really care about. Whereas progressives, they can't help talking about everything and diluting their message, and often with irrelevant things that people don't care about. Progressives suffer a lot for this across the Western world. And this is why, you often see, you'll see, like, if you take a country like Germany, for example, like their left party, which I think is called the left, they always get like 10% of the vote. And whereas all the other parties get like 90%, because they spend 90% of their time talking about things that people don't care about, right? Same thing with all the other European countries where they have proportional representation. Like, there's always one left-wing party, like radical progressive party, that gets like barely 10%, because they're just waffling on about rubbish, But the thing is with conservatives are arguably in an even worse situation, as both conservative politicians and voters are increasingly dedicating lots of time discussing homosexuality, right? So conservative voters want to talk about homosexuality, and conservative politicians are intelligent enough to recognise this and cater to their voters, right? And so a lot of time is spent talking about, gay this, gay that, gay this, gay that. But again, this is actually, and you might think, well, isn't that smart? Because the conservative politicians are doing what the public want, like they're following the public trend. This is populism, right? But it's actually even worse, because it means that these politicians get elected, and they make these sort of populist culture war gesture moves, let's say. Like, there's loads of things like this, like we will ban rainbow flags in this place or whatever, which is like, okay, that's it, okay, great. But at the same time, the politicians have no incentives to deal with the more delicate and difficult issues, like, as we mentioned earlier, deadbeat fathers, for example, or abortion, which would actually require some very serious, dedication to solve. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that many conservatives reward conservative politicians by doing the bare minimum, by promote, like, the politicians will say, like, rainbow flags bad, and they'll clap like seals, like, that's my man, yes. Where it's like, well, hang on, what are you doing about everything else? Hang on, society's on fire. What are you doing about all the other things, right? And the politicians turn around and go, hey, I removed the rainbow flag. You should be grateful. And it's like, sorry, but we've got bigger fish to fry, right? That's the opportunity cost of talking about these things, of obsessing about these things. It's very rarely taken into consideration in conservative circles either. And it's great because, conservatives might win elections, right? They might win in first past the post systems, for example. Like, they might win a majority of the vote, or at least a majority of the seats. But what does it matter if, when these parties get elected, they don't actually solve any of the underlying problems that society has, because they're too busy throwing around populist nonsense? And I'm not saying that it's irrelevant. I'm not saying that, for example, a rainbow flag in a public building, which I'll talk about later, is irrelevant. But I'm saying that there's bigger fish to fry, and these bigger fish are never fried because of this. And what I'm trying to say here is that every second spent talking about gay marriage is a second not spent talking about the gargantuan decline of straight marriage. Right? I mean, for God's sake, we've got like a 50% divorce rate. People are marrying less than ever. So many men are single, especially young men. Many women are single, especially young women. Fertility rates declining, birth rates declining. There's a gender war going on between men and women. I talk about this all the time. We've got all these problems, and yet many conservative politicians and many conservative voters, all they want to talk about is oh, actually, look at those two men over there. Like, I don't think they should be allowed to get married. And it's like, look, I totally understand this position. Like the point of marriage is an insurance policy for offspring, right? The sons and daughters. It's not really about the man and the wife, as bizarre as that sounds. But that's what it is. It's a societal safety net to keep the man and woman together, to ensure that the offspring have a more healthy upbringing. It's a legal and a financial contract. That's what it is. And obviously, in that sense, it makes sense as a heterosexual institution rather than a homosexual institution as well. Totally agree. But surely you must recognise that comparing gay marriage to straight marriage is like comparing a fly to an elephant. And the problems that are going on in straight marriage right now are sacrificed with every second that goes by talking about gay marriage. Like, there's only, again, like the example I used earlier, there's only so much time in the day. And you have to spend that time, you have to spend that political capital wisely. And if you misspend it, you end up ignoring the things that really, really matter. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, get your priorities straight. Right, literally, like, pun intended. Get your priorities straight. Focus on the downsides that the heterosexual majority of people are currently suffering, rather than hyper-focusing on this homosexual minority. That even if I understand the logic behind it, even if I totally sympathise, but the opportunity cost simply isn't worth it from a practical perspective. Maybe in a society where marriages, like divorce rates are at record lows, men and women love each other again, and everything's hunky-dory and everything's great, then maybe you can go, right, now what's going on with this gay marriage thing? But right now, in the 2020s in Western society, I have no patience for people wasting my time and wasting political capital talking about this issue. There are way bigger fish to fry. And that is my second harsh truth. Every moment conservatives spend fixated on homosexuality is time not spent focused on more pressing heterosexual-related issues. It's a fact. It's simply not debatable. It's true. And I don't. Again, I am so baffled by so many people who fall for this low IQ, and it is low IQ. This individualistic obsession with populism. This identifying the homosexuals, pointing at them and saying, these guys are the be-all, end-all. No, sorry, there's bigger fish. Like, we have way more pressing crises in society than that, I'm afraid to say. Which brings us on to number 3. Thought beyond stage 1. One of my favourite authors and favourite thinkers, if you would, is a guy called Thomas Sowell. He's an American economist. And I've read many books of his, big fan. And one of the things that he often says, he has this phrase, it's almost like one of his catchphrases, which is thinking beyond stage 1. In fact, he actually wrote a fantastic book called Applied Economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1. It was in the subtitle. That was all about this. And the idea is, because he's an economist, he spent a lot of time studying the 20th century communist regimes, but also a bunch of other regimes. And he was, the point he tries to get is that a lot of communists, when they take control of the economy and implement a centrally planned economy, they don't think beyond what he calls stage 1. Like, they think like, right, we're going to liberate the proletariat and punish the bourgeoisie by creating a centrally planned economy. Like, they think of the aims, they think of what they want, but they don't think what happens after that. Like, how do you get to that point? Basically, they don't think beyond stage 1. They don't think past the initial stage, which is why a lot of these countries end up bankrupt and broken and a mess, because they don't think beyond stage 1. And I love this phrase, think beyond stage 1, thinking beyond stage 1, because it applies so much to a lot of conservatives in this regard. And I think there's I want to give 3 quick examples, I think, of conservatives not thinking beyond stage 1, starting with what I call a lack of shadow sight. So it's easy to understand why conservatives focus on homosexuality when constantly barraged with pride flags like the standard of a conquering empire. Right? I mean, if you, especially in June, if you go outside, you see flags like this everywhere. You don't know what half of them mean. They're all over the place. There was a viral video out in the UK that came out a few years ago of British flags that were on this line in London, and there was a man, a worker, who was hired to take the British flags off and put the rainbow flags on, and a man recorded him saying it like, are you proud of yourself doing that? And the worker turned around and said, do you think I want to do this? I'm not happy with it either. I'm just doing what I'm getting paid to do. Right, and this video went viral because a lot of people view the rainbow flag, especially when it's taken in place of the national flag, as being a form of imperialism. It's like you've been conquered. It's like some sort of regime that is declaring dominance over you in a way. Even though, it made sense. It made sense to have rainbow flags at a time when perhaps homosexuals were treated in law negatively. As sort of like a rebel movement against such discrimination. It doesn't make sense now, where on the contrary, you actually get thrown in prison if you discriminate against homosexuals. Like now, it doesn't make sense now to have this flag in a sort of looming. It almost comes across as a taunt in a way to a lot of people. And so I totally understand why a lot of the rhetoric that conservatives have around homosexuality is caused by this almost this imperialistic feeling. Like you go out, you see it in advertisements, for example, Apple, here's a new watch, here's a new Pride wallpaper, here's a new Pride watch band, this character's actually gay, surprise. It's like so many things are like, it's almost like a barrage. Like, I totally understand. I totally understand why people focus on that as a result. But consider the much worse issues that go on behind closed doors that often, like abortion, for example, that only often come to mind in an abstract or religious sense. Like if you go outside in the Western world, you might see a pride flag, then you start thinking about homosexuality. But you're not going to go outside and see an abortion. It's not like, oh yeah, I was going to McDonald's and on the way I saw an abortion. It's like, no, what are you talking about? Like these things happen behind closed doors. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. Consider how much of what you focus on politically has been emotionally imposed by an artificially high external exposure, rather than assuming it has been logically imposed by an accurate, balanced view of reality. Like a lot of people think that what they see out in the world, that is reality, that is like an accurate, equal representation of the real world. They don't realise that a lot of things are artificially promoted. And a lot of bad things that go on in the world happen behind closed doors, happen in the shadows. They're not out there in the public eye. It reminds me of like news, right? Like, for example, I remember there was a forum about Ukraine on Reddit, terrible website. And it had before the Ukraine war, it had about 20,000 people. Because people didn't really care about Ukraine. People didn't talk about it. But then after the Ukraine war broke out, I went on this forum again, a year after the war broke out, and suddenly there was like 2 million people. Like it had increased in population by like 1,000%. And it made me realise like it's amazing how easily controlled people are if you show them certain stimuli but hide other stimuli. Like you can get people to obsess about certain events and certain things, but also not obsess about other things if you just keep them in the shadows. Like, for example, people talk about the Ukraine war a lot. People talk about the Israel and Palestine war a lot. But there's numerous wars going on in Africa, for example, right now, where hundreds of thousands of people have died. Or in the Middle East, in like Yemen, for example, where there's been loads of people dying. And yet people don't really talk about it because it's not brought into the attention of the public through the media. It's almost like a forgotten war, forgotten wars. And the point I'm trying to make is that you've really got to consider that you do not have an accurate representation of the rights and wrongs in reality. There's a lot of things that have a lot of attention and a lot of things that don't have a lot of attention. And what I'm saying is, this can only be countered by the ability of shadow sight, which I know shadow sight admittedly sounds like a cancelled Assassin's Creed spin-off, but what I mean is you have the sight in the shadows, you look in the shadows, you purposely look for the things that you don't get exposed to in normal day-to-day circumstances. You look at the stats, you look at the data, what's going on behind closed doors, outside of the cameras, outside of what the media tells you and what social media, people on social media who look for attention, what they're latching onto, what's going on in the world that could be much worse than the things that are being spoken about that you don't hear about. Right? That's what that is shadow sight. And shadow sight is a form of thinking beyond stage one, because a lot of people, when they don't think like, they get angry about things and go, man, this really annoys me, like I'm so angry about this, but they don't think, how much of this is an artificially high exposure and what's going on in the shadows that I'm not focusing on? They don't think about beyond stage one. So they obsess about politics and they obsess about things that really in the grand scheme are irrelevant compared to the things that they don't see. But you have to think beyond stage one to understand that. Does that make sense? Another example would be focusing on ends without means. So, let's say you're a conservative and you despise homosexuality and you want to end its influence in society. Well, that would be your end, right? Your ends are, you want to end homosexuality in society, all right? Okay, well, let's say now that you somehow became the leader of your country. What is your plan to achieve your goal? Well, that's the means, right? So you have an end. You want to stop homosexuality in society. What is the means? How are you going to go about doing that? And what I find is that so many people, they dream of a world without realizing what it would take to make that dream a reality, and whether or not that dream would actually turn out to be a nightmare. I mean, seriously, like if you wanted to truly eradicate homosexuality from society, what kind of things would you have to do? Should we have, for example, a sort of absurd anti-gay police force where if there's two men who are in a house on their own and they happen to be listening to George Michael's Careless Whisper on the speaker, should we have a policeman that knocks on the door and goes, hey, you're not being gay in there, are you? I mean, this is quite suspicious, two men on their own listening to George Michael. Are you sure you're not being gay in there? You bet. I'm going to come in and make sure you're not. Like, what kind of society do you want to create here? Like, how far do you want to go? Do you really know, like, what means you want to take to achieve those ends? Have you really thought beyond stage one? And again, comprehending such often absurd means is a thought of thinking beyond stage one. When you have an aim and you realise what it would actually take to get that aim, you realise a lot of the aim is a purely emotional reaction, or even if it's not an emotional reaction, even if it's genuine, it's often not worth it. Like it's not like the kinds of infractions that you would have to create in society, the amount of effort that you would have to put in to achieve said aim, is almost laughable, comedic, and absurd, as it says. And lastly, would be uncomprehending backlash. Overemphasizing homosexuality can actually backfire on conservatives by politically activating people against them who would otherwise be inactive, right? I mean, it's all fine and dandy getting the torches and the pitchforks out at gay people. What you don't consider is, do you not think that people are going to get the torches and pitchforks out at you, right? I mean, you'll have, like, for example, well, it says here, naturally this ensures more progressive electoral success and thus may delay pressing issues from being resolved. Like, you'll have, like, what if you had an election that was like 51% progressive, 49% conservative, and it turns out in the data afterwards that there was a 3% swing towards the progressives because so many people, voters who otherwise wouldn't have even been voters, they would have just been like inactive. They were so disgusted by how many conservative people treated and talked about homosexuals that they went over to the progressive side of the aisle. And now you have a government that is progressive, and for the next 4, 5 years, whatever, you're going to have to deal with everything else getting worse. More immigration, more gender wars, more all of the problems that spawn from progressivism. You're going to have to deal with 4 or 5 more years of that, because you couldn't comprehend the backlash caused by how you're treating people, right? I mean, it's just common sense. And again, keeping such backlash in mind is a form of thinking beyond stage one. Now, obviously, I'm not saying, as many neoliberals like to say, that optics, I hate that word, is the most important thing. Obviously, if you have values, you can't just betray those values like some sort of prostitute for the sake of winning a popularity contest in a democracy. Your role should be that you're meant to try to convince the public of your political beliefs rather than you bend your political beliefs for the public. Otherwise, what do you stand for? You're just like a sort of empty vessel. I'm not saying betray your beliefs. I'm saying that have some understanding that in a democracy, in a democratic system, you do actually have to care about how you are perceived and how people perceive you and how you talk to people. And you have to pick your battles wisely, if you would. And these things do have an effect. There's a lot of people who are otherwise sane people who put their hat in with the progressives and can actually become insane people as a result over time because they are so disgusted by the lack of empathy or the lack of grace or the lack of class that a lot of people have when it comes to this issue. And that is not something that should be underestimated. And so, these are examples of not thinking beyond stage one, which brings us on to the third harsh truth. Conservative political rhetoric on homosexuality often spawns from emotion, not logic, leading to nowhere practical. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know how anyone could disagree with that. Just look at the last 10 years, the last 20 years. What strides, what achievements have been made on this issue? Almost nothing. It has almost always backfired. It has almost always failed. Again, I'm not asking people to abandon their religious or political beliefs or bend for the times. I despise that sort of progressive temporalism. But I am saying, have some brains to be able to zoom out and see the bigger picture and see the perception and pick the battles wisely. Which brings us on to number 4, the greater character. I want to talk a little bit about a man called Alan Turing. British people might know about him, but I think a lot of people from outside of Britain may not. If you are from outside of Britain and you know who Alan Turing is, then my hat goes off to you. But Alan Turing was a British code breaker against the Third Reich during World War II. And he played a crucial role in breaking the German Enigma code used to encrypt the military communications. Historians estimate such work helped shorten World War II by 2 to 4 years, saving millions of both Allied and Axis lives, shortening the war essentially. After the war, he assisted in forming the creation of modern computing, including the Turing test, a thought experiment to measure a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behaviour. You might have heard about the Turing test a lot because obviously recently there's been the rise of artificial intelligence, and one of the whole things about artificial intelligence is measuring its intelligence, right? And so, the AI is tested against the Turing test. And so, that's quite an interesting life that Alan Turing had there, right? Like quite a smart guy, right? But as you can see, this is only the first slide on Alan Turing because there's another part that I've not spoke about yet. The other part about Alan Turing is that he was a gay man. And in 1952, he was prosecuted for engaging in a private homosexual relationship, which was illegal in the UK at the time. As punishment, he was given the choice between prison or chemical castration, to which he chose the latter. Being artificially pumped with estrogen malformed his body physically and made him even more ill mentally. In 1954, he ended his life by cyanide poisoning at the age of just 41. Wow, right? That is absolutely insane. And the point of the reason why I'm telling you this story, a lot of people would say, well, why are you talking about this? Because this happened in the 50s, and that was a long time ago, and it's not like this would happen today. But I'm going to there's this sort of idea I have called the greater character, right? And the idea behind the greater character is that it's like the main thing that people think about when they think of someone, right? So if I said to you, like, Gordon Ramsay, what do you think of? Do you think, oh, man? Like, the defining feature of Gordon Ramsay is that he's a man. Well, no, but he is a man. Okay, Scottish. No, that's not his defining feature, but he is Scottish. Chef, yes, right? Like, when you think of Gordon Ramsay, you think chef. Like, he is a chef. That is what Gordon Ramsay is. Like Tiger Woods, right? Same thing. He's a man. Yeah, but that's not all he's known for, right? He's had difficulties with women, right? Yeah, but that's not all he's known for. Golf, right? He's a golfer. When you think of Tiger Woods, you think golfer. And what I'm asking you with Alan Turing is, what is his greater character? What would you say is the more important slide out of those two to describe his character? Would you say that it's, Alan Turing, the code breaker, who broke the Enigma code and came up with the Turing test for artificial intelligence that is still used to this day? Or would you say that it's Alan Turing, the homosexual, who had a gay relationship? Well, I'm just going to be honest with you here. The tragic part about Alan Turing is that it should have been the former. It should have been the code breaker, right? But because of Alan Turing's death and the way that he died and the tragicness of his death, people actually tend to think about him more because he was a gay man today. But, it's so obvious to me that the inability of the post-war British government to recognise the greater character of Alan Turing was undoubtedly a national disaster, right? I mean, if I was the Prime Minister of Britain back then and someone said to me, hey, that Turing guy who broke the Enigma code, he was pretty good, right? And I was like, oh yeah, he's a pretty smart guy, one of our geniuses. And someone said, yeah, he's gay though. I wouldn't turn around and go, right, that's it, castrate him or put him in prison, this is unacceptable, right? Of course, it's easy for me to say that because I grew up many years later and I'm having a modern lens on a historical period that I was not a part of. But I think even back then, I mean, it's hard to say because I'm not alive then, but it's difficult to even comprehend that people did think that back then, right? Like the inability, like the fact that Alan Turing was a homosexual was overwhelmingly seen as that's his greater character, as opposed to all the great things that he did and the fact that he was a genius, one of Britain's rare geniuses. No, that was just ignored in favour of homosexuality. Like, I kind of feel like I'd like to think if I was Prime Minister that I would have gone, you know what, okay, he's gay, we'll keep it on the down low, give him £1 million in a lab and let's see what he can do for the next 40 years. You know what I mean? Like, you want to use your geniuses, even from a purely not even a moral perspective, from a purely utilitarian perspective, you want to use your geniuses in a utilitarian way as best as you possibly can. And because that's the greater character, surely, like the greater character of Alan Turing, his greater effect on the world was his code breaking and technical abilities, right? As opposed to the fact that he was gay. Like, how on earth is that even a comparison that could be made, logically speaking? And you know what's funny about this? I wasn't going to include this. I've just thought of this now. Do you want to know? People don't realise this, but there was a guy who was a member of the Nazi Party in Germany during World War II, obviously. I think his name was Ernst Röhm, right? Historians correct me if I'm wrong there. And Röhm was a homosexual. He was a gay man. And it was openly known that he was a gay man. Like, he wasn't in the closet. It was known. There was a guy in the Nazi Party who people knew was gay, and he was high up in it, right? So much so was it known that even the Social Democrats made fun of him in their propaganda, made fun of him for being gay. And Hitler obviously knew about it. And Hitler actually said, I know he's gay, but man, he's really good at his job. So I'm just gonna ignore that for now, and I'm gonna keep him in his job. And of course, he ended up killing him later, right? It was sort of a classic Hitler move. He was kind of known for doing that, believe it or not. But I think it's quite fascinating how Hitler, who is seen as sort of like the prime Satan of the modern era, because of the mythologizing of World War II, and rightfully so in many ways. But even Hitler had this sort of utilitarian pragmatism. Hitler was obviously not a fan of homosexuality, considering he put many homosexuals in striped jumpsuits and made them wear a pink triangle and then killed them en masse in concentration camps. Obviously not a fan of homosexuality. But even Hitler had the pragmatism, when one of his own party members was a homosexual, to ignore it and overrule it and see his greater character as, an administrator for a time, even in the short term. Like, even Hitler, even the Nazis had more pragmatism, had more ability to see the greater character of one of their guys, for a time at least, than the British government did. I mean, that's absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, I guarantee the vast majority of people would find that hard to believe. But here we are. And so, by the way, to add insult to injury, Alan Turing, many years later, he was pardoned by the British government, like many decades later, and they added him to the £50 note. They put his face on the money as sort of like a sorry about that, pal. The problem is, this is actually a bit of an insult as well, in a way, because for those who don't know, British pound notes come in £5, £10, £20 and £50, right? That's the four notes. And the £50 is the highest note. So you might say, well, that's nice. That's That's like a compliment, right? To put his face on the highest valued note. But it's actually a bit of an insult because £50 notes are barely in circulation. Like, you very rarely in Britain see a £50 note. Fivers are everywhere, tenors are everywhere, £20 notes are everywhere, but you never see a £50 note. And one of the reasons is because, being the highest currency, it was often used by counterfeiters. Like, they printed £50 notes, and a lot of them were fake. And so a lot of people started to stop using them in circulation because people didn't believe they were real. Like, a lot of people said, no, I don't want the 50, give me two 20s and a 10 instead. And so they're very rare to see. Like, you will see a £50 note once in a blue moon, basically. And so, to put his face on a note that is barely seen is, well, that's quite a it's a good thing, I guess, but it's also, in practicality, a bit of an insult as well, really, because no one will ever see it. Really is an unfortunate story. But look, it's undoubtedly true, however, that there are homosexuals who do make their sexuality their entire personality. Right? I mean, I'm sure we've all come across gay people who are like, rainbow flag everywhere, drenched in rainbows, never stop talking about how gay they are. Like, I'm gay. Hey, do you know I'm gay? And it's like, yeah, we know you're gay. Like, we heard you the first 5 million times, right? Like, we all know, we've all come across people who are like this. But I don't think it's really fair to say that it's only gay people who are like this, who make their sexuality their entire personality, because it's also true for heterosexuals as well, such as, for example, the alpha male men, or the alpha male men. Like, we all know a guy, all of us know a guy, who never stops talking about how much of a chick magnet he is, and how, oh yeah, I lost my virginity like in the first second, that it was that it was allowed, like, oh, I'm having intercourse with like 50 ladies, like, oh, I've cheated on loads, like I'm an alpha male man. And we all know, like, these Johnny Bravo type characters who just never shut up about how irresistible they are to women, but surprisingly you never actually see them with a woman, which is quite interesting. Or who can forget the extremely promiscuous liberated women, who, oh God, they're running into a man's bed every 5 minutes. Women comedians are like this as well. Like, they'll make jokes. Like, women comedians in America, they never stop joking about their genitalia. Like, every joke is about their vagina this, vagina that. Like, they make sexuality everything. I'm a proud slut. Don't slut shame me, and all this sort of nonsense. But at the same time, however, they always talk about de-centering men. It's like, I de-center men, despite the fact that all I ever do is talk about how much I love having intercourse with men and how unashamed I am of doing that. It's like, let's not pretend as if there aren't heterosexual people, men and women, who never shut up about sex and never shut up about their sexuality either. And, almost everyone recognises that such people are that way from an unresolved lack of self-esteem. I mean, when you see a guy who talks about how he's an alpha male and all the women love him, you know the reason behind that. It's because he has no confidence. He's making up for a lack of confidence. He's faking it until he makes it, per se. No man talks about how irresistible he is to women unless he actually is extremely resistible to women, right? Same thing with these women. The women who sleep around with men every 5 minutes. Like, do you think a woman who sleeps around with loads of men has high self-esteem? A lot of men, one of the biggest mistakes that men make is taking these women at face value. When a woman says, like, I'm confident, like, I do what I want, and all this nonsense. A woman who sleeps around does not have high self-esteem, no matter what she says. She has low self-esteem. That's why she's sleeping around, because she has low self-esteem, because she feels empty. She wants value. What's the easiest way for a woman to feel valued, to feel important? Sexuality, like performative sexuality, giving themselves away. It's a notorious psychological fact that women who give themselves away have low self-esteem. And it's easy I feel like men understand that the wannabe alpha male men, you sort of understand, like, yeah, that's obviously the case. Women can sort of understand, like, yes, the woman who gives herself away is obviously the case. So why not also apply this same standard to such homosexuals as well? Like, if there's a guy who never stops waving rainbow flags around, going, I'm gay, and I'm proud of it, and he's very defensive about it, constantly almost looking to cause trouble about it, like, oh, is there a problem? Is there a problem about this? You must understand that he obviously has a lack of self-esteem. Like, he obviously feels like under threat or has something to prove to the world, and as a result is acting in such a manner. It's not that he actually is egotistical and narcissistic and or is some sort of, I don't know, like sex obsessed, like mind. It often comes from a lack of self-esteem. However, I actually have to say, I have more sympathy for homosexuals who make their sexuality their personality, because there's a lot more hostility to homosexuality, and they are a minority group, whether you like it or not, to the point where I imagine it's a lot more psychologically traumatic. And so it would make sense that there's a lot more sort of making up for the fact, right? Like there's a lot more intensity. I actually have a lot more sympathy for homosexuals who do that than, say, straight men or straight women. But I feel like that should be understood. Like, I completely understand it's difficult to see someone's greater character if they make their entire character their sexuality. But maybe the reason why such people make their sexuality their entire character is a lack of self-esteem caused by such mockery. And that perhaps if people's greater character, like Turing back in the 50s, for example, was seen, maybe these people wouldn't be so rabid and intense as they are. Right? Does that make sense? Which brings us on to the fourth harsh truth. It is extremely rare that sexuality is the defining feature of someone's character, regardless of sexuality, right? Like, if someone's gay, okay, what else is it about them? Like, is being gay really the only thing that they're known for? Do they have no talents? Do they have no skills? Do they have no profession? Do they have nothing that separates them from the rest of humanity? It's very rare to come across someone where being gay is literally the thing that they are known for. And if it is, it's usually because they have serious problems, who are like self-esteem, for example. And that can only really be resolved through, as difficult as it is, being kind, as strange as it sounds, rather than being rude. If you're rude, these people just double down, right? They're just like, aha, see, you do hate me, rather than, hey, relax, knock it off, right? Like, there's more to you than just that, right? Which brings us on to number 5, the final harsh truth: right-sizing. Let's say that you were in a car accident, resulting in you being stuck in a not-too-serious coma for a day, right? Not too serious coma, it's pretty serious, but, you're just like, oh, and you wake up and you're like, oh, what have I missed? What's happened, And upon waking up, your partner tells you that 3 bad things have happened while you were out. Oh, wow, 3 bad things. And you're like, oh, God, brace for impact, like, what's happened? The first thing is that the movie you were both planning on seeing next week has been delayed by a week. So you're going to have to see it in 2 weeks' time rather than next week. Damn, you were looking forward to that. All right. The second thing is that your mother was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer and has 2 weeks to live. Okay. And the third thing is that the supermarket we shop at has raised the price of toilet paper by another 5% again. Wait, hang on a minute. What was that second thing again? My mother's been diagnosed with what? Right? And in this scenario, right, any sane human being wouldn't treat any of these 3 bad pieces of news equally. No one, unless they were absolutely out of their mind, like completely and utterly socially unskilled beyond belief, would describe to their partner these 3 pieces of news equally in that list format. You wouldn't do it. Instead, you'd categorize such bad news appropriately based on severity, right? So, for example, obviously the first thing you would mention is, hey, your mother's been diagnosed with cancer, and you would talk about that a lot. Maybe after talking about that for many hours and a long time, maybe then you'd mention the movie. And as for the toilet paper, you might not even mention it, because considering the severity of the situation, does it really matter in comparison, right? Like, human beings are not robots. Like, we have the ability to understand that some things are worse than other things. And those of us with social skills, which is the average person, recognize this and we act appropriately. This is actually a problem that a lot of people with autism have, that people with autism tend to have difficulty separating the severity of certain things versus other things. and as a result are accused of speaking in a robotic list-like fashion, which is extremely frustrating to them. But again, like this is what this here, prioritizing the obvious, way bigger news of, hey, your mother's got cancer. That is what I call a form of right-sizing. Right, you're recognizing all the problems, but you're making some bigger and making some smaller, because some problems are more important than others. Right, not all problems are created equal. Right, obviously. And in this sense, it is true that there are some issues specifically related to homosexuality that spill out into understandable controversial waters and thus deserve attention and discussion. Right, so for example, surrogacy. Right, there's a practice, for example, of usually two gay men who know a woman, and they say, hey, can one of us can we use your womb? So one of us will inseminate you and use your womb, and you will give birth to our son or our daughter, right? And this is considered highly controversial. Catholics, for example, specifically speak out heavily against this, because there are ethical questions about this. For example, is a woman being used in a sort of, because a woman usually gets paid, right? Is a woman's womb being used in a sort of commercial fashion ethical? Is it ethical for the son and daughter to grow up knowing that their mother essentially didn't really want to make them and didn't really want anything to do with them, and was just a sort of commercial vessel for the two men, one of which is their father? Again, that's a very controversial issue that needs to be discussed a lot more than it is. It's progressives, of course, would just sign the dotted line, like they sign the dotted line and everything. They would just be like, yep, that's futuristic, that's a good idea. But no, actually, this is something that requires huge amounts of attention. There needs to be studies done on the psychological consequences of this on the women. A lot of the women, for example, they get pregnant and then they get attached to the offspring, right? But they've already signed like a contract that says, hey, you're going to give this son or daughter away to these men, and they don't want to when they give birth, and they regret it. They regret signing up for it, because obviously the love between a mother and the offspring that they've made is very, very strong and very, very innate. So it actually can be very psychologically traumatic. I mean, it's a nightmare situation, right? This is something that needs to be discussed way more than it is now, and is a topic that social conservatives should absolutely hound on way more than anything else, like gay marriage, for example. Another one, tangentially related, would be adoption, right? Is it ethical for two women or two men to adopt offspring? Because we know that there are some traits unique to fathers and some traits unique to mothers that seem to be beneficial when put together in the raising of offspring. Like men tend to be much more disciplinarian, women tend to be much more affectionate. Would two homosexual men or two homosexual women, is it the same? And the answer seems to be a very clear no from what I've seen. I've seen a lot of studies that say, like, actually the offspring of people who are adopted by homosexual couples tend to do very well, like tend to graduate in higher rates, tend to be richer. But that's kind of a bit of a silly thing to say, because the people who adopt tend to be of such status anyway, right? Like it doesn't seem to be anything to do specifically with homosexuals. But there definitely is, socially ethical. There's an ethical conversation to be had about the consequences of growing up without a father or without a mother, or with two fathers or with two mothers, let's say. Like that is absolutely, like, at the end of the day, the interests of the offspring have to come before the interest of the gay couple, right? I think that's universally agreed. Well, there needs to be done before you start signing the dotted line on that, as many progressives do universally. You really have to think about, what's the psychology behind this, right? Another one, education, right? I mean, sex education being taught in schools is very controversial, because you're exposing people who are very young and very immature to concepts that are beyond their comprehension. And even heterosexual sex education is controversial, but when you add homosexual sex education into the mix in that, especially when you're taking into consideration the religions that a lot of them and their parents might have, that is highly controversial. That is, to legislate that the state has the right to teach this to young people is a very, very controversial move. And also I have. There's this idea in society that sex education is a good thing. Like, oh yeah, it's a no-brainer, and if you oppose it, then you're some sort of caveman who wants it. But ever since, from what I've seen, when I look at the data, Thomas Sowell talks about this a lot as well. Ever since sex education has been introduced, starting in school, starting around the 60s, the amounts of teenage motherhood and deadbeat fathers and general dysfunctional sexual behavior, STDs, STIs, has skyrocketed. It's not decreased. Like, is anyone seriously going to say that sexual health today is better than it was in the 50s? Let's say before sex education. I mean, who would say that? Like, things are way worse now than they were then. Like, obviously correlation is not causation, but if you could plot on a graph the rise of sex education in educational establishments and the rise of like teenage mothers and deadbeat fathers, etc. Like, the two go hand in hand. There's very little evidence to suggest that sex education, from what I've seen, has actually had any positive effect at all. In fact, it might have even had a negative effect. And so to throw homosexual behaviour in there as well, I mean, that is definitely something that needs to be discussed. It's also the fact that parents really, I think, should have the right to decide what their offspring get taught first and foremost over the state. Many people disagree with that. But even as someone who's very authoritarian, I do think that's the case. I don't think that you can overrule parents in that regard, because the ripple effects of that are absolutely ginormous. It's so controversial, it's beyond belief. And of course, lastly, imperialism, right? As I've spoke about before, like, why are pride flags on government buildings, parliament buildings, police stations, right? Like there's actually been a controversy in Germany about this recently, where the German Bundestag has the rainbow flag on it, and the German Chancellor essentially ordered for it to be taken down or something, and he said something like, the Bundestag is not a circus. I think was his exact quote, because the idea was that they have one day where it's put up in Germany, which is like the homosexual, like Remembrance Day or something like that, and that's when the flag is allowed to be put up. But every other day they put it down and they put the German flag up. To have the rainbow flag up on a random day for no reason is seen as an unnecessary sign of imperialism. Like, no, there's no context to this. Like, why is this flag there? Like, what is this? Like, and there are a lot of activists who just want to put the rainbow flag on everything because they see it as a win against conservatives. Like, we're disrespecting your religion, and we're disrespecting your worldview. Like, look at us, we rule. And they don't realise that, like, well, actually, you're radicalising a lot of conservatives into believing that their religion and their beliefs are second class in comparison to yours, which is one of the reasons which could increase hostility towards actual homosexuals. Although I don't think a lot of progressives particularly care about that, because they use homosexuality as a sort of a battering ram against conservatism in a way to feel morally superior to others. But besides the point, this is obviously something that needs to be discussed as well. But, again, like how every great general picks his battles wisely, conservatives likewise must right size, not drop, the issues that are truly paramount. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm saying, right, don't talk about homosexuality in any way whatsoever again. You can only talk about other topics. No. I mean, there are some topics related to homosexuality that obviously are relevant, as I've said, but you have to right-size them. Right? You have to say, what are the issues that are really important? Let's talk about them more. What are the issues that are not important? Let's talk about them less. Right? Obviously, surrogacy, for example, is infinitely more important than gay marriage. Right? Infinitely more important. It's not even a comparison. And that's what I'm saying. In a way, all these harsh truths build on each other, but it's an extension of the greater character. Except it's the greater character of homosexuality, if you would. And so that brings us on to the last, final, harsh truth. There are some societal issues that related to homosexuality that are worth discussing, but it's important to separate wheat from chaff, right? Exactly what I just said, right? Adoption, surrogacy, imperialism, laser focus, right-size these issues, bring them to the forefront, make the public question, like, hey, is this okay? Like, what's going on here? Hang on, there's a lot of moral issues here. But, when it comes to the other things, come on. Get some priority here. Like the example of, hey, your mother's been diagnosed with cancer, but we've run out of toilet paper. Separate what's toilet paper, what's cancer, right? Very simple. And so that is my 5 harsh truths for conservatives. And we've gone through a lot here. We've gone through moral proportionality via the offspring comparison, opportunity costs via life and politics, thought beyond stage 1 via shadow sight, ends and means and backlash, the greater character via Alan Turing, and right-sizing via surrogacy, adoption, education, and imperialism. And look, as I said at the beginning, I understand that these harsh truths are harsh, and they're difficult to comprehend because it requires you to think in a very blue ocean way, to think outside of the easy to fall into emotional red ocean defaults that people have. It requires you to think outside the box. But really, when push comes to shove, is anything that I've said here wrong? Is anything incorrect, factually speaking? No. It's just uncomfortable, really, isn't it? It's just it's uncomfortable when you're so set in a position to see that position differently. Like, I haven't asked, this is another thing, throughout this entire lecture, I haven't asked social conservatives, of which, again, I would like to remind you, I am a part of, to approve of homosexuality, to wave rainbow flags around, to applaud it, to become an LGBT activist. I've not said that. But I am saying, be smart about your social conservatism. Don't go along with emotion, low IQ drivel, going along with the populist crowd. Think outside the box. Think in a blue ocean. Be pragmatic. Because I believe if every single social conservative absorbed these harsh truths, you have absolutely no idea how much better society would be on this issue overall, in the short term and the long term, than it is now. Right now, we are in a state of endless culture war over absolute nonsense, where things that are really important are being completely ignored. And you can stay true to your religion, you can stay true to your scripture, you can stay true to your politics, but you just change your modus operandi. You change your means of operation, the way that you do things. Your religion doesn't change. Your politics don't change. It's all just in the habits, right? And I think I cannot express enough what a world of good it would do. My call to action, if you would, is to absorb these harsh truths, reflect on them, and think about society in the long term. How much better would it be if everyone understood these on the social conservative side of the aisle? Oh my God, it would be fantastic. But as ever, I am curious. What are your thoughts on the harsh truths and the logic behind them? Again, I'm not going to lie. I know this, as I said at the start, this is a pragmatism over emotion lecture. So I know that it's going to be controversial and there's going to be a lot of negative comments and, blah, 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 blah. But, I nevertheless like to, whether it's positive or negative, I do like to hear them. The comment code for this one is actually very simple, quite a subtle one. And it's my thoughts. If your comment includes the words, my thoughts, I know you made it this far. I know you know what you're talking about. But as ever, I am curious to hear what you have to say, especially if you're a blue ocean thinker. Because I know what the red ocean thinkers will say. They'll accuse me of being a secret progressive, agent provocateur, blah, blah, blah. I've heard all the low IQ nonsense before. But I'm so curious what blue ocean thinkers think about this and these harsh truths. Whether you agree or disagree, I'd love to know the reasons why you agree or disagree with each of the harsh truths. I would love to know. I'm so curious what you have to say. And thank you very much to the Wall of Famers. However, as ever, it is being phased out. This is actually the last time that you should see it. And it is accepting no fresh additions, but thank you very much nevertheless. And folks, with that is all. A little bit of a shorter lecture compared to usual, but hey, I only speak as long as I think I need to speak, whether that's long or short. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.